picture this.
Yeah.
You're looking at satellite images, maybe just browsing online maps, and you see a coral reef.
Yeah.
And around it, these almost perfect rings of bare sand.
Yeah, cutting right into the seagrass or algae beds. They really stand out.
They look like these little clearings, sort of like underwater crop circles almost. It's quite a visual puzzle, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And what you're seeing there, those are known as grazing halos.
Grazing halos, okay.
And today, for this deep dive, we're going to explore the really fascinating reasons behind these bare patches and maybe what they can tell us about the health of these ecosystems, these vital ocean habitats.
Right, because these reefs are facing so many threats. And for those of you listening who want to get the key insights quickly, we've dug into a really interesting new study.
It's just out in the American Naturalist.
And it investigates these grazing halos, looking specifically at Heron Island. That's in the Great Barrier Reef, right?
That's right. A classic location for reef research.
So the study aims to kind of decode where these halos come from and what they signal about the reef's condition.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack the factors creating these sandy rings.
And understand what they tell us about that, delicate balance of life on a coral reef. Okay, let's dive in.
So one of the first ideas, the sort of established explanation, is what's called the fear hypothesis. It's actually pretty straightforward.
Fear. Okay, like fish being scared.
Basically, yeah. Imagine you're an herbivorous fish, maybe a parrotfish. You need to swim away from the reef structure itself, the coral, to munch on algae or seagrass nearby.
Okay, makes sense. They got to eat.
But the further you go from that protective coral structure,
the riskier it gets.
Precisely. You're more exposed to predators like the blacktip reef sharks you find around Heron Island are a common predator there.
Right, so it's like this invisible fence, almost, built by fear. The fish are hungry, they want the food out there, but they're constantly sort of looking over their shoulder, metaphorically speaking.
Exactly. And this fits into a broader idea in ecology, doesn't it? The landscape of fear.
Yeah, where just the perceived threat of being eaten changes how animals behave, where they go, where they feed.
So in this case, the theory goes, they nibble away the vegetation close to the reef where they feel safer, creating that bare halo. They just don't dare go much further out.
Okay, that sounds logical, but I guess it's not the whole story.
Well, that's what the researchers behind this new study started wondering. They posed some really sharp questions.
Like what?
Like, okay, if fear is the only thing driving this, why do you sometimes find reefs that have plenty of predators, but no halos?
Huh, good point.
And conversely, in places where maybe overfishing has knocked back the predator numbers way down, well, why aren't the halos much wider? If the fear is less intense, shouldn't the fish roam further?
Right. That suggests maybe fear alone doesn't explain the whole pattern. There must be something else going on.
Exactly. It hints at a more complex picture.
So what's the new perspective they're bringing?
It's really neat, actually. They started looking not just at the predators, but at the physical layout, the spatial arrangement of the coral reef itself, the part that provides the shelter.
So not just that there's a safe place, but how those safe places are scattered across the seafloor.
Precisely. And what they noticed or focused on is that these halos really only seem to form around distinct patches of this shelter habitat.
Okay.
So they started asking, well, what if the coral, the shelter, was all clumped together in one spot versus being, spread out more evenly? How would that change the halos?
And the bigger goal was to see if these patterns, these halo shapes and sizes, could actually tell us something reliable about reef health.
That was the aim. Could we use these visible patterns as a kind of diagnostic tool?
So how do they test this? They use models, I read. Mathematical models?
Yes, two main ones. The first one was purely about the geometry, you could say, thinking about those safe zones, those shelter areas as circles.
Okay, like overlapping circles on a map.
Sort of. It looked at how the pattern of vegetation cover changes if these shelter circles are clustered tightly together, or if they're more dispersed, more spread out.
And did that make a difference in the model?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A really key finding came out of this first static model.
Right, what was it?
Well, according to Teresa Ong, the lead author, if you have that shelter habitat all packed densely into one area, it actually limits how far the herbivores can explore outwards. There's just less edge, less interface with the feeding grounds for them to safely access. So less vegetation gets eaten overall.
Okay, like trying to get out of a crowded room, maybe. Yep. Harder to move around the edges.
That's a good analogy. But then, she said, if the shelter is more evenly distributed, spread out,
Yeah.
Then the individual halos from each patch start to overlap a lot more. And her quote was quite clear. She said the halos carve out more empty space in the landscape, and their distinctive patterns disappear into one another as they overlap.
Ah, so instead of sharp rings, you just get this bigger, messier-looking bare area because all the little halos have merged together.
Exactly. The clear pattern vanishes. It's quite a neat insight into how just the physical structure shapes what we see.
That makes a lot of visual sense. And it's cool that they designed this first model to be general, right? Like it could apply elsewhere.
Yeah, they mentioned potentially cattle grazing near trees or other animals using patchy shelters. It shows how fundamental spatial patterns can be.
But you said it was static, assumed constant grazing.
Right, that's a limitation. Real ecosystems are dynamic, so that led them to the second model.
And that one brought in the time element, looked at the interaction between the grazers and the plants over time.
Correct. It explored that dynamic relationship. And it revealed two really interesting potential scenarios.
Okay, what were they?
First scenario, if you have those coral patches spread out, dispersed shelter, the model suggests you can actually get cycles of overgrazing.
Overgrazing, even with predators.
Potentially. The herbivores might eat down the vegetation significantly, creating a strong halo. But then, because they've depleted their food source locally...
Their numbers might drop.
Right, which then allows the algae or seagrass to recover. The halo might shrink or even disappear for a while.
And then the fish numbers build back up and the cycle starts again.
Exactly. So you get this dynamic where the halos can actually appear and disappear, or pulse, over time. It's not necessarily a fixed feature.
Wow. Okay, so halos aren't always stable. What was the second scenario?
That was when the coral patches are more clustered, densely packed together.
Right, the other configuration.
In that case, the model indicated that the halos are more likely to be stable, persistent. Because access to those outer grazing areas is more limited, perhaps the grazing pressure stays more constant relative to the regrowth.
Okay, so dispersed shelter might lead to pulsing halos, clustered shelter to stable halos. How does this connect back to reef health then?
Well, this is where it gets nuanced. The researchers point out that on healthy reefs, you often do have strong predator populations controlling the herbivores. But interestingly, their models suggest that even on a healthy reef, you could potentially see either stable or these cyclical pulsing halos.
Wait, so a halo blinking in and out of existence isn't automatically a bad sign? That feels counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But that's a really crucial point they make. Just seeing a halo, or even one that changes size seasonally or year to year, doesn't necessarily mean the reef is unhealthy or out of balance.
So what should we be looking for then?
They argue that tracking these patterns over time is likely much more important than just, say, measuring how wide a halo is at one specific moment. It's the change in the pattern that might be key.
Okay, let's loop back to the landscape of fear idea. Does this new work replace it or build on it?
It definitely builds on it. Ong stated that the presence of halos, and even this appearing and disappearing phenomenon, is actually consistent with the landscape of fear.
How so?
The fear is still the underlying reason the fish stick close to shelter. But the shape and stability of the resulting halo is strongly influenced by how that shelter is arranged in space. It adds a layer of physical constraint on top of the behavioral fear response.
I see. And Ong also suggested this might explain why earlier studies found a weak link between just the width of a halo and the reef's health.
Exactly, because the width might be saying more about the coral layout than about the intensity of predation pressure at that moment.
Okay, that clarifies things. The fear is there, but the stage design, the reef layout, dictates the visual outcome, those sandy rings. You also mentioned predator-prey dynamics influencing stability. Let's unpack that a bit more.
Right, so think about those stable, unchanging halos. For them to stay stable.
Something has to be stopping the fish from just eating everything eventually, right?
Precisely. And often, in a healthy system, that something is the predators, keeping the herbivore numbers from exploding. They maintain a balance.
Yep.
But, as that second model showed, fluctuations can also be perfectly normal. You get overgrazing, herbivore numbers dip, vegetation recovers, herbivores increase. That cycle we talked about.
The pulsing halo.
Yes, and Ong was really clear on this point. Oscillating halos are not necessarily a sign of overfishing or poor reef health.
That's really important, because you'd instinctively think fluctuation means instability, which sounds bad.
It's easy to jump to that conclusion, but what the researchers suggest we should perhaps worry about is a sudden shift in the pattern.
What kind of shift?
Like if a reef system historically had stable halos, and suddenly they start pulsing, appearing, and disappearing cyclically.
Or the other way around.
Or if a system known for cyclic halos suddenly locks into a static, unchanging pattern. That kind of fundamental shift in the dynamics, they suggest, could signal a major change in the underlying ecosystem. Maybe a crash in predator numbers, or some other big disruption to the reef's health or resilience.
Ah, okay, so it's about the change from its baseline behavior, whatever that baseline is.
Yes, monitoring the character of the halos over time, not just their presence or absence.
So thinking practically, what does this mean for conservation? Protecting these reefs. It's hard work doing surveys underwater.
It's incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to do large-scale, detailed field surveys on reefs.
Yeah.
But the beauty here is you can see these halos from space with satellite imagery.
Right, you mentioned that at the start.
And this study really underscores the potential value of that, remote sensing. It offers a way to get a quick assessment, a broad overview of potentially huge areas of reef without having to send divers down everywhere.
So like a first-pass screening tool to identify areas that might need a closer look.
Exactly, or to track changes over broad regions. It's pretty amazing, really. Something visible on, say, Google Earth could actually be giving scientists clues about complex ecological interactions happening below the waves.
It really connects the macro view to the micro processes.
It does. And Ong also highlighted how vulnerable many reef species are, especially the endemic ones, the ones found only in specific places like parts of the Great Barrier Reef. They're facing this double whammy of climate change and often overfishing.
So understanding these halo dynamics could help track those impacts.
Potentially, yes. If halo patterns tell us something about, say, the stability of predator populations, then tracking those halos over time could be a valuable, relatively efficient way to monitor a key aspect of reef health and resilience. As Ong put it may help us keep track of whether predator populations are intact and the reef is healthy.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. These grazing halos, these bare sand rings we see from space, they're not just about fish being scared of sharks.
No, it's more complex. That fear, the landscape of fear, is definitely part of it. But the actual physical structure of the reef, how the coral shelter is laid out, clustered or dispersed, plays a huge role in shaping the patterns we see.
And maybe the most surprising thing is that halos aren't always static. They can appear and disappear.
Right, and that dynamic behavior, that pulsing, might actually be a sign of a natural, healthy cycle in some reef systems, not necessarily a problem.
But the key insight for monitoring is to track these patterns over the long term. A sudden change in the pattern from stable to pulsing, or vice versa. That could be the real indicator that something significant is shifting in the reef's health, maybe in those predator-prey dynamics.
Precisely. It's about understanding the baseline and watching for deviations.
It's genuinely fascinating thinking that we could look down from orbit and potentially gauge the health of these intricate underwater cities based on these sandy patterns. That's a real aha moment from this research, I think.
It really is. It gives us a new lens, quite literally, to view these vital ecosystems.
And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If we can see these complex ecological games playing out from space in coral reefs, well, what other hidden dynamics, what other ecosystem stories are unfolding across our planet, just waiting for us to find the right way to observe them, maybe from afar?
That's a great thought to end on. The power of observation, especially remote observation, to help us understand and hopefully protect the intricate workings of our world. It's pretty profound when you think about it.